preached through the book of 1 Timothy, and we've also preached through Titus. And so now, before we proceed on into another book, I'd like to insert an unrelated sermon from the Old Testament. You are reading in the Old Testament, aren't you? Yes. Say yes and nod your head, because the Bible is not made up of just one testament. There are two. And you all know me from the past. I'm kind of a historian that way. And so it does us good to stay balanced and not just exist in the New Testament. There's some challenges in the Old Testament for sure. We don't have the light there that we do in the New. If you read for a long time in the Old Testament, you begin to see how there was a lot of darkness there. They knew very little, and what they did know, they knew in the way of signs and types and images and things like that. But when you get to the New Testament, the birth of Christ and the letters of the epistles and all of the doctrines there, they cast a lot of light on the Old. But nonetheless, the Old Testament is very valuable to us, and we can draw a lot from it. And so I want to speak this morning to you about the Transjordanian tribes. Do you know anything about them? If I said, who are the Transjordanian tribes, would you be able to tell me who they were? Maybe not, and that's okay. Transjordanian, that means across the Jordan. We have a Trans-American Railroad, goes across the United States. We have a transatlantic cable, goes all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Well, here we have Transjordanian tribes. They lived across the Jordan River. And if you happen to draw your attention to the maps that might be in the back of your Bible, some of those maps might contain the 12 tribes of Israel and where they were positioned in regard to the Jordan River. You would see on those maps, you'd have the Mediterranean Sea all the way over in the west. Then you'd have the Sea of Galilee up north and the Dead Sea down south. And those two seas are connected by the Jordan River. It splits north to south. And so you have east of the Jordan River and you have west of the Jordan River. And there were tribes that settled on the east side of the Jordan River. They were the Transjordanian tribes. And so the sermon that I have to speak to you this morning is dealing with those Transjordanian tribes and something that happened on the banks of the Jordan River. Now, if I would have told you I was going to speak to you on something that happened on the banks of the Jordan River, you'd instantly think, oh, he's going to preach about John the Baptist. Maybe those early chapters in the Gospel of John or something like that. But no, I'm not. I'm going to preach to you from Joshua chapter 22, if you turn there. So first, I want to talk just a little bit about the geography here. Where is this land the Transjordanian tribes settled in? It's east of the Jordan, across from the promised land to the land of Canaan. And it was elevated land, narrow land. My resources tell me about 30 to 35 miles wide of a strip there, fertile for crops, fertile for flocks. And that land was previously occupied by the Moabites and the Midianites and the Amorites, and giants lived in that land. And these Transjordanian tribes that settled there, they were the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Now you say, what is a half-tribe? How do you get half of a tribe? Well, as the history goes, Jacob had sons. They made up the tribes of Israel. Jacob in Egypt. The days of Joseph, but you notice there's no tribe of Joseph in any of the lists of the tribes of Jacob. And that's because Joseph was sold into slavery. He went away to Egypt. You recall the story there, rose to second in power next to Pharaoh. And he was instrumental in saving Jacob and all of his brethren who moved to Egypt and were spared in the days of the famine. Now, when Jacob was ready to die and he was blessing each one of his sons, who later became a tribe, he got to Joseph and he gave Joseph a double portion. He called for both of Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And Jacob laid his hands on them and blessed them. So you don't have one tribe of Joseph. You have two half-tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, as a result of that. So that's who these tribes are that settled in Transjordania. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And they settled there by agreement with Moses. After conquering Og of Bashan, who was a giant, the Bible actually declares the size of his bed to verify that he was a giant. He had an iron bed, we're told. And in our day and age, our measure, units of measure, it was 14 foot long and 6 foot wide, an iron bed. Now, I don't know how tall that wall is right there. Alan, how tall is that wall?
I think this is like 13 foot.
Okay. That kind of puts it in perspective. I would say that's a giant. That's Og of Bashan. Israel conquered him. And King Sihon of the Amorites, also a giant. So Israel conquered those giants in the days of Moses. And these tribes, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they said, we have flocks, many, many flocks, and this land is good for our flocks. Give us this land right here for our inheritance. They asked Moses for that. And they went on to say, the account is in Numbers 32 if you ever want to read about it, but a few verses will suffice here. They went on to say, we will build here sheepfolds for our livestock and cities for our little ones, but we ourselves will be armed and ready to go before the sons of Israel until we've brought them to their place, while our little ones live in fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land, and we will not return to our homes until every one of the sons of Israel has possessed his inheritance on the other side of the Jordan, the land of Canaan. Now, as near as the commentators can tell, that battle, that period in which all of the battles were fought for the land of Canaan, lasted anywhere from 5 to 7 years to conquest all of that land and all of the other tribes to receive their allotted inheritance from Joshua. 5 to 7 years away from home. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the tribe of Manasseh. battling on the west side of the Jordan so their brothers could get their inheritance first. That was the agreement. They fought out of love for their brethren. They had nothing to gain by that and all to lose. They already had their inheritance on the east side. That's quite an example, in my mind, of helping our brethren when they had every opportunity to make multitude of excuses to not do it. But they did. They crossed the Jordan first, fully armed for battle. And the account of that, of course, is earlier on in Joshua in chapter 4, if you ever want to read about it. Again, a couple of verses will suffice. At the crossing of the Jordan River, you remember God stopped the flow of the Jordan in flood stage so they could cross over on dry ground into the land of Canaan and face Jericho first, the big fortified city. Well, these words are written: the sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the people of Israel, as Moses had told them. About 40,000 ready for war passed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. So here they are. First, the tip of the spear you hear. That was these three tribes, having already gotten their inheritance on the east side. Well, in Joshua chapter 22, where our narrative is for the day, and this is a narrative, so much of the Old Testament is stories, Bible stories, narratives. And so we'll read here about it. These tribes at the end of all of the conquest of Canaan, when God gave them rest on every side from their enemies, and the other tribes had received their allotted inheritance, we read that Joshua blessed them and finally sent them back home. In verse 5 and 6, Joshua gave them this admonition before he sent them away. He said, "Only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God and walk in all his ways and keep his commandments and hold fast to them and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. And in verse 8 we read, they returned to their tents with great riches, very much livestock, silver, gold, bronze, iron, very many clothes, divided spoil of the enemies. And they went home. That had to be a glorious homecoming. 5 to 7 years of bloody sword and spear and shield battle to finally get to go home. Then we read in verse 10, when they came to the region of the Jordan, which is in the land of Canaan, the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh built an altar there by the Jordan, a large altar in appearance. So here is the very first significant action of these three tribes after they crossed the Jordan River heading back home. And that was to build an altar. Now the commentators are a little bit split on whether this altar was on the east side of the Jordan or the west side. And I suppose it doesn't really matter to me. I'd like to think that it was on the east side, their own side, because why would they build an altar on somebody else's land? But nonetheless, it's kind of not a detail to fret over. The main thing is their first significant action was they built an altar in that place by the Jordan. And as the words tell us, it was large, it was obvious, it was very public display, it was not discreet and private or hidden. They built an altar. And then we notice the reaction of the other tribes that were across the Jordan when they heard the report. Verse 11. The sons of Israel heard of it and said, Behold, the sons of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built an altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan in the region of the Jordan, on the side belonging to the sons of Israel. And when the sons of Israel heard of it, the whole congregation of the sons of Israel gathered themselves at Shiloh to go up against them in war. Here's the reaction. Now, in a positive way, we would say this: their desire was for the purity of the worship of God. Really. As we read on, we'll see that. That's positive, isn't it? That's a very positive thing. They considered the building of this altar right here to be either for idolatrous worship or for a perversion of the worship of the true God. And they saw it as an act that was worthy of military intervention. They immediately suspected the worst. Now, there were provisions in the law of Moses that dealt with this very thing. So they weren't just pulling this out of the air somehow. In Leviticus 17 and verse 8, the law said, any man from the house of Israel or from the aliens who sojourn among them, who offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice and does not bring it to the doorway of the tent of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from his people. There was an established place where the tent of meeting was. There was an altar of sacrifice there. That was where the Ark of the Covenant was. All of that was established. And God wanted the worship of God centralized right there. He didn't want everybody doing their own thing here and there. And then in Deuteronomy 12 and verse 13, be careful you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic place that you see, but in the place which the Lord chooses, in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings. Now at this point in time, it was in Shiloh. That's where the tabernacle was, and the worship of God was located there, the altar of sacrifice, the ark. And so in the eyes of Israel, these tribes across the Jordan were now no different than the Canaanites. They built this altar, their own rogue altar. And to them, the facts appeared plain enough. Either it's worship of another god or it's perversion. So they had in a positive way, they had a desire for the purity of the worship of God. In another positive way, verse 11 tells us, their zeal was for the honor and the worship of the Lord. That's very positive, wouldn't you say? But they were overzealous. And overzeal oftentimes precedes overreaction. Overreaction is the downfall of being overzealous. Zeal without knowledge, zeal without wisdom. Wisdom guides it. Zeal always needs wisdom to guide it. Now, zeal is a strange word in the Bible. Zeal is it's neither to the right or the left. It's not bad or it's good, or it's not good. It depends on the context it's used in. Zeal simply means heat. It means fervency and earnestness. So here, overreaction, it's the downfall of being overzealous, zeal without knowledge. Too much heat oftentimes sparks a fire. So instantly, Israel was ready to go up in battle against their own tribesmen who were the first in battle for them crossing the Jordan River and in all the land of Canaan. They're ready to go against them in a military campaign. So positively, their zeal was for the honor and worship of the Lord, and they were all about the purity of the worship of the Lord, but they were overzealous. Then what else? Let's read on. Verse 13, then the sons of Israel sent to the sons of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh into the land of Gilead, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, and with him 10 chiefs, one chief for each of the father's household from each of the tribes of Israel, and each of them was the head of his father's household among the thousands of Israel. So here's a delegation that represents all the other tribes, and Phinehas is leading it. And they came to the sons of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh to the land of Gilead, and they spoke with them, saying, thus says the whole congregation of the Lord, what is this unfaithful act which you have committed against the God of Israel, turning away from following the Lord this day by building yourselves an altar to rebel against the Lord this day? Is not the iniquity of Peor enough for us, from which we have not cleansed ourselves to this day, although a plague came on the congregation of the Lord, that you must turn away this day from following the Lord? And it'll come about, if you rebel against the Lord today, that he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel tomorrow. If, however, the land of your possession is unclean, then cross into the land of the possession of the Lord, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take possession among us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, or rebel against us by building an altar for yourselves besides the altar of the Lord our God. Did not Achan the son of Zerah act unfaithfully in the things under the ban, and wrath fall on all the congregation of Israel? And that man did not perish alone in his iniquity. So here, not only were they zealous and overzealous, but here they had a fear of incurring judgment for sin. Now, is that good or bad? It's good to fear incurring judgment because of sin. That's basically a good thing. They put forward the actions of these three tribes and call them unfaithful actions. And the scope of the resulting punishment, they fear, is going to be like the case of Peor, they cite that, and the case of Achan. Now, the case of Peor, we're not going to go deeply into that, but I'll give you just a brief overview of that. It's found in Numbers 25 if you want to read about it sometime. But you recall the Moabites hired Balaam to curse Israel. You recall that? God wouldn't let him curse Israel, but in fact turned it around and forced him to bless Israel. And so Balak lost out 3 different times trying to curse his enemy, and this is the Moabites, right in this area. And so what happened? Balaam came up with an alternative. He counseled Moab to introduce Midianite women to Israel and lure them into the worship of Baal. Now, foreign deities, Baal and all these other heathen deities, immorality was part of their worship. And so Balaam seduced Israel through these Midianite women at Peor. Now, At that point in time, Moses was still alive. And a plague broke out among the nation of Israel because of this immorality with these Midianite women and the introduction of Baal worship. And lo and behold, some Israelite man high-handedly took a Midianite woman into a tent right in front of Moses and the leadership. Now, do you recall who it was that handled that? It was Phinehas, this same Phinehas, son of Eleazar. He took his spear, he went into the tent, he executed both of them in the sight of Moses and Israel and God, and the plague was stopped right then when he did that. That was this Phinehas in his zeal. So you see, he's a zealous man. Fervency, heat. That's the case of Peor. So they say, is not the iniquity of Peor enough from us, from which we have not cleansed ourselves to this day, although a plague came on the congregation of the Lord? And then they cite the case of Achan, and you remember his situation, don't you? Achan is the one who took those valuable things whenever Jericho was toppled. And the word of the Lord was, kill everyone, take nothing. Well, he took a garment and some silver or something like that, buried it in his tent, and the very next battle against small little town of Ai, Israel lost. Many people died. So in both cases, it's being cited right here in Joshua 22. At Peor, a plague came, a lot of people died. And in the case of Achan, Achan's sin cost the nation. There were soldiers that died in that battle against Ai, and Israel turned their back and fled. So that's being recounted right here to these Reubenites and Gadites and the half tribe of Manasseh. What are you guys doing? Don't you remember back then how many people suffered as a result of one person's sin? And so they want to put it to a stop, these Israelites do, right at the start. That's a good thing, basically, to deal with sin in its infancy, right? Someone said it's best to kill a serpent when it's still in the egg. I understand that. Don't let it get out where it can bite you. Someone else said that a spoonful of water will put out a fire at its very beginning. But if you let it go, buckets won't suffice. So those are just a couple of old sayings, pithy old sayings that say the same thing. They're trying to stop this right now because they're saying if you guys do this, God is going to judge the whole nation because Achan did not perish alone in his iniquity. So we see good and bad, and that's what I'm trying to bring out here today in this. The applications are there are good things and bad things on both sides of the Jordan, so to speak. So we can err in two different ways here. One, we can err in giving offense carelessly. And I'll speak to that here in just a minute. And then we can err in taking offense causelessly. And we'll deal with that here in a minute. We'll kind of separate the two. So first, giving offense carelessly. How did that happen? Well, it was indiscreet for these three tribes to do this, to set this altar up, without first contacting the other tribes and letting them know they were going to do it. It was carelessly giving an offense because they knew the Old Testament law in regard to the perversions of sacrifice. They knew that person shall be cut off. Calvin says this: "From the very appearance, it could not fail to occur to the mind of anyone that they were establishing a second altar. And since it might be so naturally regarded as a wicked deed, they ought certainly to have consulted their brethren in so grave and important of a matter. Wouldn't it have been good if they sent a couple of guys over there to Shiloh to tell them, we're going to set up an altar on our side, and this is our reason for doing it, rather than just doing it? So it was indiscreet. They gave offense carelessly. And they deserved some blame here. They acted as if they were alone in the world, and they didn't consider what offense that might easily arrive from the novelty of what they were doing. And it was novel. So for the sake of transparency, a sentence of explanation a lot of times will prevent a misunderstanding. There's a thing called maturity of foresight. Have you ever heard of that? Maturity of foresight? Well, maturity of foresight is this. You that have little kids, small ones, and they're just learning how to drink and eat at the table, you give them a cup and they take a drink and they set it on the edge of the table, half of the glass on the table and half off. And instantly you're befuddled. Why would they do that? That's a lack of maturity of foresight. That comes later. You learn that over time. You get more mature and you have foresight. You transpose into the future. How is this going to affect situations and people and things? That's called maturity of foresight. Kids don't have any of that, and it's a lot of times befuddling to parents. But it's very valuable to develop that. So right here, it's easy to see how that would have really helped. Well, then we have the wisdom of making an inquiry, verse 13 and 14. They did appoint Phinehas to go with the delegation and inquire. That was wise to do that before they went to battle. The wisdom of making inquiry. It would be wise to seek an explanation before going to war. And they avoided a civil war. Someone said when wisdom holds the reins, it keeps zeal from becoming a runaway horse to break its own neck and the neck of the rider. That was wise to send that delegation because that wisdom overrode the zeal. The nation wanted to go to war, and it avoided a civil war. Now we see the error of the 10 elders in verses 16 through 20. And they take offense causelessly. They assume the guilt of those whom they suspect. They assumed they were guilty. Now let's read on a little bit further here in verse 21. Then the sons of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh answered and spoke to the heads of the families of Israel. They said, the mighty one, God the Lord, the mighty one, God the Lord, he knows. And may Israel itself know if it was in rebellion or if an act of unfaithfulness against the Lord. Do not save us this day. If we've built us an altar to turn away from following the Lord, or if to offer a burnt offering or a grain offering or other sacrifices of peace offerings on it, may the Lord himself require it. But truly, we've done this out of concern and for a reason, saying, in time to come, your sons may say to our sons, what have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? For the Lord has made the Jordan a border between us and you, you sons of Reuben and Gad, you have no portion in the Lord. So your sons may make our sons stop fearing the Lord. Therefore we said, let us build an altar, not for burnt offering or for sacrifice. Rather, let it be a witness between us and you and between our generations after us, that we're to perform the service of the Lord before him with our burnt offerings and with our sacrifices and with our peace offerings, that your sons may not say to our sons in time to come, you have no portion in the Lord. Therefore we said, it shall also come about if they say this to us or to our generations in time to come, we shall say, see the copy of the altar of the Lord, which our fathers made, not for burnt offering or for sacrifice, rather it's a witness between us and you. Far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away from following the Lord this day by building an altar for burnt offering or grain offering or sacrifice, besides the altar of the Lord our God, which is before his tabernacle. So the error of the elders, where they took offense causelessly, they assumed the guilt of those that they suspected. And they begin with a challenge. They show up when they came to the tribes, the 3 tribes, and in verse 16 they say, what is this unfaithful act which you've committed against God? They start with a challenge, and it's based on a misconstruction of a doubtful action, and they charge their brothers with transgression and rebellion and would go to war with them over it. And the case is so plain to them, to these elders, that their sense of justice overrides their sense of love. Somehow their estimation of the 3 tribes plummeted from high to low in an instant. In this very chapter, in verse 3, we read these words of Joshua to these 3 tribes. He says, you have not forsaken your brothers these many days to this day, but you've kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. That was what he said in verse 3. He applauded them for how they kept their promise and fought for their brethren all of these years and all of these battles. Fast forward now to verse 16. The whole congregation says, what is this unfaithful act which you've committed against God? Turning away from following the Lord this day and building yourselves an altar to rebel against the Lord this day. You see what they went from and to? Such high estimation for fighting it all out all these years for us when you already had your inheritance on the east side. They went from that high estimation, go in peace with all of your spoil from the war and so on. They went from that all the way to, what is this unfaithful act, rebelling against the Lord? Instantly. We must justly wonder at the over-hasty jealousy of the 10 tribes against their brethren, whose faithfulness and valor for God and his people they had so long experienced in the 7-year war. Yet now to find fault when themselves have only matters alleged, but no things proved, says one writer. They came to those conclusions instantly, and all of that good that was done previously was wiped out. They changed in a moment, and now it's, what is this unfaithful act? They inconsiderately laid on their brethren charges of which they were totally innocent. And it's difficult, I admit, to not assume the guilt of others whenever we have suspicions. It creates a prejudice, though, that's hard to overcome in our own minds. And it causes us to condemn, to be condemning rather than conciliatory. Notice now the response of these tribes. They had a gentle answer, which is very good. A war would have resulted if the response would have been as heated as the accusation. There would have been bloodshed, and it would have been Israel's blood, not giants or Canaanites. Instead, war was avoided and wrath was turned away by a gentle answer. And there doesn't appear to be any resentment by those who were misunderstood. The Reubenites don't seem to feel any personal insult as a result of being misunderstood. That's something there too, isn't it? Because by human nature, we tend to do that. We bristle at being misunderstood, and instantly we want to fight back, and before you know it, there's a skirmish and a divide, but there seems to be no resentment. And it appears that self-control ruled their response. Now, they emphasize with extreme emphasis the fact that they were innocent. They say 3 names of God 2 times right there. And they proclaim their innocence and they give the reason for it. So they attempt to clear their name and the conscience of those who were accusing them, set them free as well. And what do they say? They say their reason and their motive was not separation, but inclusion. All along, it was exactly the opposite. It was not independence, but it was unity. It wasn't for now only, but it was for future generations even. They desired unity, inclusion, and oneness, and not separation, self-interest, and independence like they were being accused of. They were saying, though we're separated by miles and mountains and rivers, we're still one redeemed people. They valued the privilege of being a part of the people of God, and they worked to preserve what they valued. That's what they were doing. This altar was not an altar of sacrifice. It was a memorial. It wasn't an altar of idolatry or anything other than a memorial of witness. And what a better reminder of their association with their brethren than a copy of the original altar on which blood was shed for the remission of sins. What could be more fitting a reminder than that? So it's amazing here what has happened. Here, a religious symbol constructed with an innocent motive and for a praiseworthy end was interpreted as a sign of idolatry and rebellion. But I've said it before, things are frequently not what they seem, even if it appears plain at first. So the construction of the altar, when the reason given, instantly became as wise and noble an action as before it was deemed idolatrous and rebellious. Once they gave the reason for building that altar, everyone could say that was really wise to do that. Whereas before that was a bad thing to do. Another thing to learn, it's wise to think about and prepare for future generations. That's what they were doing right here. It wasn't that they were worried about their own relations in that day with the other tribes across the Jordan. They were worried about their children somehow missing out, somehow the Jordan dividing them and being a border and their children missing out. And who cannot sympathize there with the anxieties of the fathers? who were anxious for the inclusion of their children in the salvation of God. Even Abraham in his day said to the Lord, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." And it was not without merit that these tribes were fearful of that happening in the future, because a few chapters later in the book of Judges, in Judges chapter 2 and verse 7, the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. And after that, all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. And you launch into the cycle of Judges. Idolatry, deliverance, idolatry, deliverance, and you have all the judges, every man doing what's right in his own eyes. So you see, the anxieties and the worries of these Reubenites and Gadites and was not unfounded. It actually came to pass later on, altar or not. So here we are. We should maintain a true gospel and right worship and a unified church as well. And by faith, this will be like an altar of witness for our own children, the next generation coming up. That the Lord is God. So Phinehas, verse 30, the priest, and the leaders of the congregation, the heads of the families of Israel who were with him, heard the words which the sons of Reuben and Gad and Manasseh spoke, and it pleased them. And Phinehas, the son of the priest, Eleazar, said to the sons of Reuben and Gad and Manasseh, "Today we know the Lord is in our midst, because you've not committed this unfaithful act against the Lord," which, by the way, they suspected and misunderstood and laid at their feet. But now you've delivered the sons of Israel from the hand of the Lord. And then Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, and the leaders returned from the sons of Reuben and Gad, and from the land of Gilead back to the land of Canaan to the sons of Israel, and brought word back to them, and the word pleased the sons of Israel. And the sons of Israel blessed God, and they did not speak of going up against them in war to destroy the land in which the sons of Reuben and Gad were living. And the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad called the altar Witness. For they said, "It is a witness between us that the Lord is God." I like stories that have happy endings. This is a happy ending, and it could have been really bad. So we want to give every opportunity to future generations to be included among the people of God, don't we? There's nothing better to memorialize than this: the Lord is God. That's what that altar of witness stood for. So this is an Old Testament story. The altar of witness and the Transjordanian tribes. And there's plenty to learn from all of that, isn't there? It's amazing how the Bible is so applicable and has so much to teach us. Well, amen. We'll stop there.